Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you whom I may not know, my name is Bill Rich. I'm the interim rector here while Trinity awaits the arrival of Morgan Allen, the parish's next rector, who will arrive just after Easter. And it's a pleasure to welcome you, whether you're a longtime member of the parish or whether this is your first time here. It's so nice to have you all together for this occasion. I'm not going to be introducing our speaker. My job is to talk to you about the Price Lectures, the series of which this is a part, and to give you a little bit of history. In April of 1770, a man named William Price, who was one of the leaders of this congregation, wrote his will. In it, he specified that a series of lectures and or sermons should be given every Lent, and he left a bequest to fund those. Thus, we have a lovely bequest from which we get to fund these lectures. You should be glad that we have broken through his will in certain ways. Because as a good Protestant of the 1770s, he specified some of the topics. In fact, he specified all the topics of the lectures. He had a control issue. And several of them were anti-papist screeds. And we no longer treat one another that way, at least here. And so we've broken through the will. And so the topics are are broader and I hope clearly appealing to a wide group of people. What he also specified in his will, this shows his generosity, this is his better side, I think, was that though these were to be free and open to the public, a free will offering was to be taken that should not come to Trinity. The money should be given to two other parishes in town, namely Old North, the famous Paul Revere Church, and the first Unitarian parish in the city, King's Chapel. So any money that you give, there are plates on a table near the door. Any money that you give doesn't come to Trinity. It's his ongoing legacy of generosity if they will go to those parishes. And if you've ever thought, gee, what I do with my will doesn't matter, you might want to reconsider. Here we are, all these years later, benefiting from his generosity. And now I get to turn to my colleague, Patrick Ward, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here. We are, as Bill said, in the middle of a series. We hosted last week Charles Stang from Harvard's Divinity School, who came to talk to us about origin and early Christian views on reincarnation and the eternal soul and universal salvation. On the very last Sunday of this month, the 31st, Nancy Kane from Harvard's Business School, you may know her too from frequent appearances on the Jim and Marjorie show, will be with us to talk out of a book she's written, Forged in Crisis. She'll be with us specifically to talk about the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer on March 30th. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard University. He is the John Cogan Professor of Humanities. He is the leader of a movement, a critical movement called New Historicism, or what he terms cultural poetics. A way of thinking that understands that the literary and the historical permeate and influence each other. He's written that he has been struck by the strangeness of reading words that seemed addressed to me personally, yet were the products of people who long ago crumbled to dust. Something to think about in the wake of Ash Wednesday. Many of you know and are familiar with his work as a Renaissance scholar, as a Shakespeare interpreter. His book, published in 2011, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, was awarded with the National Book Award. And the following year, 2012, he received Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. The book that he's going to be speaking out of today, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, was published in 2017. He followed that in 2018 with a book called Tyrant, Shakespeare on Politics, which is commentary on not only what's happening in the United States, but globally, in placing Shakespeare in that context, that political context. I was delighted to find out that he's a graduate of Newton North High School. And I'll ask you to join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Stephen Greenblatt.
It's an honor to be here and make sure you can hear me. I turn this on. Yes. Thank you, Ward. I grew up, as you say, in this area, and already as a child, I experienced the wonder of this astonishing space above us. This space I didn't know, but the glory of the Trinity Church, and it's a special privilege, an humbling one, to be here today. Doubly humbling because I have to tell you that the experience of writing this particular book on Adam and Eve, which took quite a few years, largely taught me how little I actually know, how much more there is to know about this subject. And I am happy to share some of the things that I explored with you, but I'm also very eager to hear your explorations as well. Anyway, I became interested in the space created by the story of Adam and Eve, and in the way in which a great, strange, imaginative story became such a crucial part of religious belief and experience, and that space in which poetry and faith interact is one that has long interested me, and is the core of the book that I wrote about the story of Adam and Eve. That story is an old one, probably written down in the form with which we're familiar already in the 6th century before the Common Era, and almost certainly much older as an oral story. May date for centuries and centuries before the form in which it was written down in the Bible. But there are older stories, as people discovered only in the 19th century, really, when in the wake of explorations done in the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh and other Mesopotamian cities, the little cuneiform, I almost knocked over my own drink here. The tablets, the clay tablets, were deciphered. It took a great deal of work to do so, and it was just, oh, thank you. You don't have to do that. That would be amusing to see me over backwards. So it was found that however powerful, however deep that origin story, the origin story we all know, was that there were older ones that had strange echoes, internal peculiar echoes with the one that we know. And they came from Mesopotamia. The earliest ones, perhaps the earliest one, is the Enuma Elish. So we're going back now to 1800 before the Common Era. Vastly earlier than any trace of the Bible. And that Mesopotamian story was a celebration of the creation, which was, in this account, understood to happen when the god Apsu, who was associated with fresh water, rushed into Tiamat, the goddess of the sea. And the the mixing of the fresh water and the sea produced a kind of silt that was in fact the creation of the world. So this is sort of primordial sexual act that produces the world, and then there's a set of stories that are told in the Enuma Elish about what happened after that. They're violent stories of parricide, matricide, of the triumph eventually of the storm god Marduk, who was celebrated particularly in Babylon as their great god. And the Hebrews would have experienced the story of the Enuma Elish more than they ever wished to experience it in the 6th century when they endured what is known as Babylonian captivity, when their territory, Jerusalem and surrounding territory, was conquered by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, and large numbers of the Hebrews were taken to slavery in Mesopotamia, building the walls of Babylon, working in the irrigation ditches and so forth. And annually there was a reading of the Enuma Elish, a spectacular New Year's festival in which these stories of the creation were rehearsed and Marduk was celebrated. They say none of this was really known. I mean, what was known, of course, were the Psalms. By the waters of Babylon we wept, and so forth, the experience of the Hebrews, but the particular relation to these stories wasn't known until these origin stories were recovered with the deciphering of the cuneiform. And with those decipherings came a whole recovery of a whole set of accounts, including accounts of a sacred tree guarded by various guardians, and that was associated with the idea of the tree of life. A whole set of things that must have been floating around in the Sumerian world, including, maybe most spectacularly, a story that was again deciphered, dug up not from Babylon but from Nineveh, the ruins of Nineveh, and deciphered by an Englishman in the 19th century, that told, and this is the one you probably have heard of if you've heard of any of these, a story called the Atrahasis about a great flood in that world. And that, again, much, much older than the Hebrew story of the flood, but a tale eerily like the tale of Noah, in which the world is saved. And that's worth dwelling on for a moment before we get into the Adam and Eve story, because it also includes a variant on the Mesopotamian creation story that's quite interesting. In the Atrahasis, the story from Nineveh, there's a problem, which is that in the world, which is that the world needs work. The gods are happy, but they need to labor in order to survive. They need to dig irrigation ditches, to work in the garden and so forth. And that's done by the junior gods. The senior gods are relaxing, of course. The junior gods complain, and Marduk, ever clever and resourceful, comes up with a great idea, which was that he'll create humans to work in the garden, but really work in the garden. Digging ditches, they're called Lulu, the black-headed ones, and he creates them, and it's a splendid achievement, very, very clever idea, because the junior gods can now relax along with the senior gods. But there is a problem, which is that the humans reproduce. We do that. And in the course of reproduction, we make a tremendous racket. Babies make noise. And this is very much the story of people who live. These are the first cities in the world. Nineveh, Babylon, and so forth. It's about urban life, and it's about the racket if you live in an apartment house just above a family with a baby. And the senior gods and then even the junior gods are disturbed, especially when they want to rest. Every few days they want to have a nice long, or in the afternoon they want to have a nap, and they're squalling babies. So the senior god, the senior-most god, decides that he's had enough. The junior gods can resume their labors. He's just going to kill all the humans. And one of the junior gods befriends a particularly virtuous human named Atrahasis. The name means the extra wise one. And he warns the human and tells the human how to avoid the catastrophe. First, there was going to be, I can't remember the order of things. First, there was going to be a tremendous fire, then earthquakes, then there were a set of disasters that were going to destroy all the humans. And each time he warns this one particular human how to save himself and his family from the disaster. And the senior god gets increasingly frustrated, as you might imagine, because after every one of these it reduces the population begins to come back, the babies start crying again, and then finally he decides that's it, total flood, and will destroy them once and for all. And yet here too, Atrahasis is advised ahead of time, he builds an ark, and he gets on with his family and so forth, and survives. At the end of which, the senior god decides that, all right, I will make a kind of bargain. I have some clever ideas. I will introduce means to keep the human population down. Female infertility and infant mortality. And that will reduce the numbers of humans and keep my afternoons a little quieter as I want them to be. And that's the story's account of the origin of the miseries of our lives. It has nothing to do, in other words, with human responsibility, bad behavior, moral problems, evil in the world, as it does as you remember, the Noah story. It's just about the fact that we're noisy, we're human. And so that it's a story without a moral foundation. But in some sense it frees, you can see it has certain advantages to it because you don't have to feel that when your baby dies, it has to do with some guilt or evil that humans have done, you or someone. It's the nature of our mortal condition and our relationship to the universe. The Hebrews came up with, having heard the story, knowing the story clearly, manifestly, the Hebrews came up with this astonishing alternative story. An alternative story not only about Noah surrounded by people. The Noah story, as you know, is very morally problematical because all right, Noah is surrounded by people who've been behaving extremely badly, but did everyone behave extremely badly? Did the children behave extremely badly? Did the animals and so forth all got destroyed in the flood? But nonetheless, the story suggests that there's a kind of moral meaning to it, and also it's not just the story of Noah, but that was adjusted, but obviously the creation story of humans, and above all, the story of Adam and Eve, where the mortality, human misery, including all of the excruciating pain in childbirth, on the part of women and various other sufferings, the necessity of labor, all comes about because of a moral failing, parts of a failure to obey. That's an idea, to observe a commandment. That's an idea that doesn't, as they say, not contained in the Mesopotamian origin story. It's an incredible invention with all kinds of consequences for us. It's the story that's been for centuries one of the key ways in which we, the inheritors of the story, in Judaism, in Christianity, and Islam, have understood ourselves, our fears, our desires, our dreams of bliss, our deepest sense of guilt and shame and suffering. The story has helped, in that sense, to make us who we are. As I say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all committed themselves to this account of human origins, an account that originated among the Hebrews. But the Hebrews themselves, as they evolved into to the religion we know as Judaism, didn't actually focus their principal attention on the origin story. They put it at the beginning of the Bible. It was very important to them to put it at the beginning of Genesis, in the same way that the Enuma Elish put the creation, including the creation of humans, at the beginning of their account of Marduk's greatness. But the story of the Jews' relationship to their God, Yahweh, didn't principally focus on the first humans, who were not Jewish after all, Adam and Eve, but it focused on Abraham. And the earliest Jews, as you know, the ancient Hebrews were iconophobic. They prohibited graven images. But there are a few very early graven images. This is late by our standards, but still early for the Jews. 6th century of the Common Era from Bet Alpha in Israel. But it's characteristic that it represents not Adam and Eve, but it represents, in this rather crude way, it represents Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Isaac, and that poor little creature who's going to take Isaac's place. It's that story that is the one that most of all counts for the Hebrews, for the Jews. And indeed, the early rabbis urged that the story of Adam and Eve not be taught to people until they're adults. It warned not to teach the story to children. And when you read the early accounts of rabbinical responses to the Adam and Eve story, you can sort of see why they were deciding that, well, we'll wait a little bit before we have the story told to the young. First of all, the rabbis noticed, as it's been noticed many times, that there are two different accounts of the creation of the woman that have been stitched together in the Genesis story. Briefly, to remind you, it may not be uppermost in your mind, there's an account in chapter 1, extending into chapter 2 of Genesis, in which God makes human in his image, male and female created he them. It says roughly in the Bible, male and female created he them. And then in the later, in the chapter 2 of Genesis, we're told that God created the man outside the garden and brought him into the garden, and then realized that it wasn't good for the man to be alone, and took a rib from the man's side, the story that you will remember, and fashioned a woman out of that. Those are not entirely, they're not the same story. There are various ways of trying to get them to be the same story, but the early rabbis suggested, for example, this interpretation. At first, God created her for him, and he saw her full of discharge and blood. In this version, God left the man's eyes open. He saw the woman being formed, and there was blood and unpleasant things. If Jonathan Swift says in the 18th century, I saw a woman flayed the other day, and you'll hardly believe how much it altered her appearance for the worse. You don't really want to look inside. Thereopon, and in this early rabbinical account, Adam was unable to consummate the marriage because he was so nauseated by having seen what had happened. Thereupon, he removed her from him and created her a second time. We'll do a second version of the creation. Then a variety of different attempts to explain what appears to be a discrepancy between the first and second creation, including, you may know the story of Lilith in popular culture. That's not a biblical story, and so forth, but that there seem to be two different females involved. Or then Rabbi Eliezer, reflecting on the scriptural text, this is the moment at which Adam says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." When Adam bursts out in a kind of lyrical welcoming to the woman who's been created. And Rabbi Eliezer said that this teaches that Adam had intercourse with every beast and animal, but found no satisfaction until he cohabited with Eve. It's a fairly widespread notion that speculation. It's a way of trying to understand what appears to be anomalous in the Hebrew text, which is that God in the second version of the creation seems to have created only the man. And then God says he realizes it's not good for the man to be alone. Couldn't he have anticipated that ahead of time? So the rabbis, rabbinical speculation is that the man tried all the other animals first. How lobsters got involved, but found no satisfaction with them until he cohabited with Eve. And then there were rabbinical explanations for the moral act, for the scene of temptation. There's a reflection, there's a rabbinical reflection on the verse, and the woman said unto the serpent. The rabbi said, "What do you mean the woman said unto the serpent? Where's the man in this account?" Now, where was Adam during this conversation? So Abba Bar said he'd engaged in intercourse and fallen asleep. Then other sages said, no, at that time it was an alternative account. The Holy One was taking him around the entire world, a kind of world tour, saying to him, here's a place fit for planting trees, here's a place for sowing cereals. And meanwhile, his wife was back there having a conversation with the serpent. That's why she got in trouble. And then reflection why she succumbs to the serpent. Imagine a woman, Levi says, imagine a woman borrowing vinegar who went into the wife of a snake charmer and asked her, how does your husband treat you? He treats me with every kindness, she replied, save that he doesn't permit me to approach this cask, which is full of serpents and scorpions. And then the neighbor, who behaves the way neighbors do, obnoxiously says, it contains all his finery, said the other. He wishes to marry another woman and give it to her. What did she do? She inserted her hand into it, and he began biting her. When her husband came, he heard her crying out, have you touched that cask? He demanded. And that's an explanation for the verse, hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee, and so forth and so on. You can see what's happening, which is that the paradoxes or the peculiarities of the Hebrew story, which is not central to, as they say, not central to the Jewish idea of what it is to be Jewish. That's what the Abraham story is about. Excite the kind of rabbinical speculation that's, how should we say, not good for children. Hence, don't approach this story, the rabbi said. Don't teach the story till they're older. And then there's one further aspect of this, and I won't spend any more time on the rabbinical history than this, which is that the rabbis believed that not that the greatest thing, that the highest form of human bliss was to live in paradise. The highest form of human bliss was involved in the Torah, in the five books of Moses, and in study. As you probably know, the rabbinical idea of paradise was a place in which you'd study all the time. No breaks whatsoever, no necessity of stopping studying. And that idea that the goal of everything is to get to the Torah meant that the rabbis had to explain that there was something already before paradise, that God created the Torah first, and that was also the goal toward which we were all heading. And that meant that even they brooded about the very peculiar variation, as you probably know. And at the end of each of the days, the 6 days of creation, God said, behold, it was good, behold, it was good, behold, it was good. And then he says, behold, it was very good at the very end. So Nachman said in Reb Samuel's name, behold, it was good refers to the good desire, and behold, it was very good refers to evil desire. So that's a very odd thing to say. It means that being evil desire is very good, the kind of thing that led the humans to be expelled from paradise. Can the evil desire be very good? That would be extraordinary, I'll say. But for the evil, however, except for the evil desire, however, no man would build a house, take a wife, and beget children, says the Midrash Rabbah. Therefore, the act that led us to be expelled from paradise was a good thing. It led us in the direction of civilization, and ultimately led us in the direction of a life spent studying the Torah. Okay. There must have been alternative, we know there must have been alternative accounts, particularly somewhat later than the period that I'm starting with, within Judaism itself, that were pushing against this current of rabbinical speculations that I've been looking at. And they get that alternative account gets articulated most powerfully and most momentously by that renegade Jew, Paul. So Paul articulates a very important, momentous, radical shift, and it's a shift that we can summarize by saying that the Adam and Eve story is as a central story to the understanding of who we are, is not in fact a Jewish story, it's a Christian story. And it's a Christian story that, as I say, must originate from some sort of alternative Jewish world, but is articulated most clearly by Paul. Paul, who writes in Romans that therefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, that's to say through Adam, sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed onto all men, for all have sinned. We have become mortal through the sin of the first man, and we've somehow inherited that sin, all of us. That's an idea that is not a central, powerful idea in the Jewish tradition, and doesn't become a central or powerful idea in the Muslim tradition either, but it's absolutely at the center of the Pauline account of the human destiny. And not only this, but this. That death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. It would take me too long to tease out the full implications of this, but I will leave it to your reverence to do so. But it has to do with a notion of figural typology in which Adam anticipates and is the figure for the one that is to come. The one that is to come is Jesus, who will take away this terrible inheritance that ran from Adam to Moses, that is to say, till the creation of the law, and then after the creation of the law, the sin that we commit by violating the law. For if by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is the new Adam who comes and takes away the sins that we've inherited from, and the death that we have inherited from the old Adam. That it's only through Jesus Christ that the horrible burden of death through sin can be removed, and we can anticipate an eternal life and happiness. Okay, that's the central idea here that makes the story so crucial, because if you want to understand who the new Adam is, you had better understand who the old Adam is. The story of Adam and the fate of Adam becomes bound up closely because of Paul in Paul's account, to the understanding of the Savior, of the Redeemer. And therefore, as Paul says, by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one, the free gift came upon all men to the justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. So it becomes a kind of central principle of Christian theology. And it's a central principle of Christian theology that is very much bound up with an attempt to understand why we die and what happens to us after we die. It's not clear, by the way, it's famously ambiguous in the Hebrew of the Bible story, whether the biblical myth, the Genesis myth, imagined that we weren't mortal before the sin of Adam and Eve. But it becomes quite clear in the Christian tradition that yes, we were, at least in this Pauline element of the Christian tradition, that we were not meant to die. Originally, the death came as a result of sin, the sin of the first humans. And that meant, among other things, that when early Christians in Rome, this is a very, very early catacomb, 3rd century, I recommend that you go there, but it's in a slightly unpleasant neighborhood in Rome. Not one of the beautiful catacombs in the Via Appia, the catacomb of Saint Pietro and Marcellino, when they dug themselves, when they wanted to visit their dead underground, and the Christians were burying each other together, they would bury them in these little slots. But if you had enough money, you could actually have a room of your own, as it were, or at least with your family, not on one of these little underground streets. And these rooms were hollowed out of the tufa under Rome by these artisans, one of whom left a picture of himself on the wall. It's kind of amazing. They would have had as you can see, a lamp on hung on a spike in the wall, and then with a pick and axe, he opened up the spaces to bury the dead. And in these little rooms, there were pictures. Who was this? Noah, exactly. Noah, like a jack in the box, popping up and seeing the bird bring the olive branch back. And then, can you guess who that is? Jonah, exactly. Jonah being vomited up by the whale. And this one, Daniel in the lion's den. And so these are images, obviously, to give hope to the families visiting their loved ones. Hope of salvation, hope of resurrection, hope of protection from the forces of destruction. And strangely enough, in one of the places, there's this. This is the earliest representation of Adam and Eve that I've been able to find. 3rd century of the Common Era, and it's not, as they say, accidentally. It's a Christian image, and also not accidentally, it's in a grave tomb. This is not an image in that sense of hope, as the other ones were, but as you can see from the posture of Adam and Eve, shame. And with good reason, they should be ashamed, because it's they who are responsible for the fact that we're down in the ground in the first place, visiting our dead. So that image of shame, and particularly of sexual shame, is one that has very rich implications, and it's a way of explaining why, as you can still go through. This is not a particularly well-kept catacomb, and the bones are still around you in the darkness. Now, take a step back. The story of Adam and Eve is, as I've already suggested from the rabbinical from the rabbinical passages is a story that's very tricky to interpret, very problematical to interpret. It is, as I'll have more occasion to say, it's like a story written by Franz Kafka. The more you think about it, the more kind of disturbing the story gets. And we can explore some of the places that it's caused headaches for people for the last several thousand years. But already it was causing headaches, at least for some early Christians. Marcion, who was a bishop born in 85, so we're talking about a very early Christian bishop, and quite importantly, from a Gentile, not a Jewish family. Marcion, here with his followers, unrolling the scroll, Marcion argued that we don't need this headache. We don't need any of this Jewish rubbish. We have the Savior. And that figure of Christ doesn't depend, as Paul seemed to suggest. Christianity hasn't sort of worked out yet. When Marcion's writing, it's Orthodox theology. It doesn't depend on understanding an incredibly primitive story like the story of Adam and Eve. Marcion had come from as they say, Gentile world, had read Plato, the pre-Socratics, and comes from a different philosophical background, and thought that these Jewish myths, these Jewish stories, were only going to cause problems, and he proposed basically to get rid of fundamentally all of them. And there was a huge fight in the 2nd century in Christianity, at the end of which Marcion lost. And so he was ruled a heretic, his followers were ruled heretical, and his position was defeated. And was defeated, but not completely, didn't completely vanish. So in 1945, an Egyptian peasant digging in for fertilizer near Luxor, in Egypt, found a jar, a 3-foot clay jar, which he thought, he was a little afraid to open it because he thought a genie might jump out of it or whatever, but eventually curiosity and greed got the better of him and he smashed it. And to his immense disappointment, he found not treasure, but he found books, the least likely thing to wish for. In that circumstances, he just found in the desert a bunch of old books. And these are the so-called Gnostic codices. They were in the form of codexes and not of scrolls. And they had been buried, probably in around the 3rd or 4th century. They had been buried by some monks, evidently lived in the area, at a time in which certain, the church again was arguing about what its central theology would be. And these are most famous because there's an alternative gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, that had not been known. But these were written in Coptic, and they were only deciphered, studied and understood fairly recently, actually. You've had people talk about them, yes, the Gnostic codices here. So I won't go into them, except to say that lesser known than the Gospel of Thomas are a set of remarkable codices about revisions of the story of Adam and Eve. That say that one of them says that the general line of these codices is that the enemy of humanity in the Adam and Eve story is God, the character called God, and that either the woman is the hero or alternatively the serpent is the hero. What kind of God is this? Says one of these. First, he envied Adam that he should eat from the tree of knowledge, and secondly, said, Adam, where are you? Didn't he know where he was? God does not have foreknowledge, since he didn't know this from the beginning, and afterwards let him cast out. Surely he's shown himself to be a malicious envier, says the testimony of truth. So either it's the woman or the serpent who was the hero of the story, and that helps to explain why these books were buried under the sand and not recovered for 1,500 years. I mean, that position lost decisively in the church, but it meant that, how should we say, it meant that the central Kafka problem of the story was understood already 2,000 years ago. The central problem being, how should we say, just in the shortest form, what does it mean to have a story in which you are given a prohibition not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? The horrible things that will happen. But you can't possibly reliably observe that prohibition unless you know what the difference between good and evil is. So that's a little twist that takes you into this very strange territory. So one way of dealing with that territory, and that's the way in which the Jew Philo of Alexandria, or Origen, whom you heard about very recently, that the way they dealt with it was through the way sophisticated intellectuals could deal with it was through allegorical interpretation. It doesn't mean what you think it means. That's what literary types are always doing. These themes of philosophize symbolically. No trees of life or understanding have ever appeared on the earth in the past or ever likely to appear. Not really a tree that we're talking about. Not fruit, it's not a serpent. I mean, this is a philosophical allegory, and we can make it sound as fancy and sophisticated, so you don't have to be embarrassed about it. And there's a lot of early literature, and even later literature, that tries to redeem the story, to deal with it that way. It's the way in which most of us would try, I think, not only then, but now, to try to deal with what seems otherwise too uncomfortable in the story. Here's Philo saying the snake is a symbol for pleasure. Why? Because it's a legless creature. So he comes up with a bunch of explanations for why a snake should be a symbol of pleasure. And it's just a symbol of this, not really. That's the way allegorists work. But all of this gets runs the fancy allegorical interpretation, as it were, save the phenomenon for those of us who have read Plato and Aristotle and are serious about our intellectual lives, runs into a wall, and the wall is called Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine is tremendously smart, he's also from a Gentile background and has read all the appropriate fancy Greek and Latin philosophical texts. He was a Platonist as a young man and so forth, but he insists that the story has to be taken literally. He worked for 15 years on a book called on the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. He never finished it because he actually can't do a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, but he tried anyway. And he centrally insisted and won, in effect, for Christianity, the insistence that the story has to be taken as real. There has to have been a garden, there have to have been two actual original humans, there has to have been a tree and snake and so forth. And that is what he bequeathed to the Christian tradition. And as a result of bequeathing it to the Christian tradition, along with the notion of original sin, he generated an immense tradition in both texts and images of trying to understand what they looked like, what they were like, what the story could mean if it was taken in any way seriously. What's the snake's motivation? Before the fall, what did the animals in the garden, the other animals in the garden, do? Did the animals in the garden die, for example? Theologians asked all the hard questions. Did the animals die in the garden before the transgression? Why would they die after the transgression? They didn't do anything. Or if they died before the eating of the apple, what happened to their corpses? So there's a tradition of imagining that they left the garden just before dying, for example. I mean, that's one early theory. Were there fleas before, and mosquitoes in the garden before the fall. There's a late medieval saying, Adam had him, referring to the fleas. If there weren't, that is a very big problem because it means that there was some other creation of creatures after the first 6 days which seemed to violate, and so forth and so on. I could go on forever about these problems because theologians were, because of the necessity, not just theologians, of taking the story seriously in the Augustinian manner, had to ask all the questions. Did Adam and Eve shit? And they asked, and it's a long tradition of thinking about this problem. Luther says, yes, they did, but it didn't smell. I mean, and that's not a sign of zaniness, however zany it seems to us. It's a sign of seriousness with which the enterprise was taken, the Augustinian enterprise of taking it seriously, including, of course, centrally the moral problem of sinfulness and of the inheritance of sin, which was the center of the Augustinian theology of original sin. I will just very quickly, because I've taken longer than I should already, show you a few images and talk a little bit about where the story goes. This is one of the earliest medieval representations of the Hildesheim doors from the 11th century in Germany. I love this because God, here associated with Jesus, of course, is pointing a finger at the man. The man who looks embarrassed about what's happened is bending over. He's putting his arm under to point at somebody else. She's responsible. And then, of course, she's pointing down there to the slightly strange-looking serpent who looks more like a miniature dragon. So that way of distributing responsibility, of trying to explain that it wasn't me, that it is represented so successfully, I think, in the Hildesheim doors. This one, Peter Kermester's Historia Scholastica. This is where, on the whole, medieval Christians didn't read the Bible very often, but they read summaries of the Bible, such as this one by Peter Kermester. Here, this one from the Vatican. Here, God has taken the rib out of Adam's side. Adam's sleeping somewhat, I think, uncomfortably on that rock. But he's taken the rib out. He hasn't yet formed her body, but at least he's made her head, so she looks like a sort of stick puppet up there and holding her up. And he's blessing her already. Here, things I think begin to get quite interesting in the 12th century. Some of you may have seen this remarkable image in Autun from a sculptor named Giselbertus of an Eve who is in this extremely, not a stick figure, the opposite of a stick figure now, who begins to have a very complicated affect. For one thing, she's sexually attractive in a way that a bone with a head on it is not. She's turned, upper part of her body turned to us, and her lower body turned in a physically impossible way, but hidden. The twist is hidden by that conveniently placed bush, and she's in a complicated state of I don't know how to describe it. Is she penitent? Is she wondering what she's doing? Does she know that her hand is reaching back here to take a piece of fruit? Is she aware of this serpent? Here, that's a very morally complicated representation, and it was on a lintel above the door of the church, and you're walking in to the church under this very strange and complex image of a woman who is the image misogynistic. Are we supposed to think that female allure is what leads you into sin? It's very hard, or is it more complicated than that? It's quite difficult, I think, to say, which is part of its excitement or interest as a work of sculpture. Many of you will have seen this famous Masaccio in the 15th century from Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, of a terrifyingly, conspicuously miserable and naked Adam and Eve being expelled from paradise. When I first saw that image in the 1960s as a student in Italy, they were dressed, at least in fig leaves, which was a much more accurate representation of them, actually, in terms of the biblical text. But when they were cleaned in the late 70s or 80s, it was revealed that they were absolutely naked, which is not actually biblical text, but to emphasize their vulnerability, I think, in Masaccio. Okay, very quickly, a few more images, and then I'll hurry on. This is the most famous representation of Adam and Eve in the Renaissance. Albrecht Dürer's great woodcut, actually not a woodcut, copperplate engraving of Adam and Eve, which he signed as if he had been there himself. Albrecht Dürer was making this. And Dürer took representations of gods, Roman versions of Greek gods, and refashioned them, Apollo and Venus, into Adam and Eve in their physical perfection just at the moment before everything begins to go south, as it were. And the Eve is apparently taking the fruit from the serpent. Adam is looking at her. She has another fruit in her hand. He's holding on to the tree of life, but not for long. This is as I say, the representation of just the moment before it all becomes a disaster. You can see that his foot is resting lightly on the tail of a mouse who's being stared at by a rather fat pussycat who hasn't yet tasted mouse, but is about to. As soon as the fruit is eaten, and Adam's foot moves, and the world becomes what it now is. Okay. I won't, as I say, we can come back to these if we want in the question period. Lots of images of this one developing. If there was misogyny in the Giselbertus, it now becomes very explicit. In this student of Dürer's, Hans Baldwin Green, where Eve is a kind of coy, sly, quasi-pornographic figure of temptation, reaching out to the serpent and at the same time being touched by her husband, who's already turning into a corpse. Sexual desire produced by a woman is in fact what leads you to your corpse state. And the Adam and Eve story is responsible in one of its forms of development with the whole history of blaming women for our fate. I was going to say a little bit about Milton, but I won't, just because, as I say, it's taken me longer than I probably should have. Milton picks up on the Dürer image and describes Milton was blind at this point, but must have seen the Dürer earlier and other representations like it earlier in his life. In this case, as Milton has it in what is the greatest of all the Renaissance reimaginings of the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve have been fully warned that there's an enemy in the garden waiting to tempt them, and Adam says to his wife, "The wife where danger or dishonor lurks, safest and seemliest by her husband stays, who guards her, or with her the worst endures." And that turns out to be a big mistake to say that, because his wife gets incredibly offended. Aren't I your equal? Aren't we both equals in paradise? Am I meant always to stay next to you? Frail is our happiness, if this be so, she says. And Eden were not Eden, thus exposed. This is paradise, she says. I'm not supposed to actually tremble and have to stay by your side because an enemy is here. I'm as morally autonomous as you are, Milton's Eve says. So Adam, in the crucial moment in Book 9, says, "All right, go, for thy stay not free absents thee more." That profound and terrible recognition that you may have had with a loved one most of us as parents have with children, in which you realize you can't just keep them any longer, you have to let them go. Because if you try to keep them that way, they're actually further away from you than if you let them go. But it's a very hard lesson. And it turns out in Milton to be a catastrophic lesson because Eve falls, she says, with thy permission then, and leaves. It's slightly ironic, but she falls into the devil's wiles, and with her, Adam. Now, Milton wrote this in the 1660s, but already the story was in trouble, which is one of the reasons that Milton was also engaging in a profound way to try to reimagine the story. The story was in trouble already starting in 1492 and afterwards. Because what happened in 1492 is that the Europeans began to encounter hundreds of thousands of naked people who didn't seem to have any shame. And you were supposed to have shame, as it were, built in as a result of the fall. So it posed immediately a problem that circulates around in slightly below the surface of things, because it's a heretical, controversial thing to say. What does it mean that a huge amount of the world that we didn't know existed doesn't seem to know about the nature of human beings as a result of the fall? And there are many, many discussions of this, many representations, this today from the 16th century, of naked natives standing by trees and so forth and so on. This from Adam and Eve, this is from an account of the Algonquian Indians and how they lived their lives in Thomas Harriot's book about Virginia. But he begins the pictures, the famous John White pictures of the Indians, by showing Adam and Eve. People understand already in the 16th century there's a problem about trying to reconcile the story of Adam and Eve with the nature of the lives of the Native Americans. One way of trying to think it through, but it was difficult, was through the notion of Noah's three sons. The trouble with Noah's three sons is that it helps to account for Europe and Asia, Southwest Asia, Canaan, Africa, and the Middle East, but it doesn't seem to get America in there. The Western Hemisphere. It's extremely hard to figure out where those people came from. And there were then, starting in the 16th and 17th century, increasing numbers of debates about how to explain this. The one I write about in my book at some length is a man named Isaac Laperere, who wrote this book saying that there were humans before Adam. Hominis ante. There must have been humans before Adam. That's the way to explain this. He was a very interesting 17th century French intellectual, Isaac Laperere. He made the mistake of publishing this book, as you can see. He was visited in his apartment by armed guards. His apartment he was in Belgium at the time, by armed guards from the Vatican, who took him free of charge on a trip to Rome, where he had a free and frank conversation with the Pope, who made it clear to him that either he would renounce these views or he'd be burned at the stake. He decided to renounce the views, and he lived actually a fairly long life afterwards, so he kept saying, I actually think there were men before Adam. I won't say more about Laperere, but I'll say one or two last things. One of the problems that becomes for the 18th century a central problem of the Adam and Eve story is that if the consequences of disobedience were so serious, how could the humans have understood it, given what God has told them? Telling humans who evidently don't know what it is to die, that they might die if they eat of the fruit, is, again, a version of the Kafka problem. How could they possibly know what it meant? And that any responsible God would have to do what we all do with our dangerous things, which is to wall them off. Guard. You don't put a sharp kitchen knife into the hands of your 3-year-old and tell them, don't do anything to yourself or your little sister. That's not a sane way of behaving. We are very careful, and we've thought a lot now about what to do with our nuclear waste and how to warn people 10,000 years from now who may not know our language, who won't understand our science. We put these crazy things on our nuclear waste. Maybe they're not crazy, thinking that someone a long time from now may be able to decipher them and not open the box and hurt themselves. At least we make that gesture. And already in the 16th century, as you can see from this Cranach, they were thinking, Adam scratching his head, what is that? The problem of how much you need to know in order to be secure, and what God's relationship, we may have responsibility to God, but what's God's responsibility to us? Is a question that begins to be asked in a serious way in the period, and then it gets bound up with notions of in anatomy theaters of what the body is like and what we are as bodies. So you have people in the 18th century trying to reconcile the story of Adam and Eve with the medical work that's been done trying to figure out what fetuses are and what and I won't go into that further. Quick look at Rembrandt's marvelous Adam and Eve, in which the nakedness of the first humans is represented in a completely different way than it was in some of the images we've seen, in which it really is like seeing your parents naked. Something you actually rather not see. They have, as it were, real bodies, and they're complicated people, as Rembrandt represents them. And this is a tradition that goes all the way through to our world. This is Max Beckmann in the 20th century, and the whole story of modern painting that keeps coming back to the nakedness of our first parents, but now in the Rembrandt spirit and not in the spirit of Dürer. I want to close my too long remarks with one last thing to say, which is this, which is that our thinking about the story is now inflected by this alternative account of our origins. And two things to say about this. One is this is from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, one of those dioramas, a famous one. It's not accidental that even though we are trying since Darwin to think of a new way of accounting for our origins, that this image is so uncannily evocative of Adam and Eve. It's based officially on the discovery of these footprints. There is absolutely no reason to believe that these footprints were laid simultaneously. They could be 10,000 years apart that were in the mud. But it's irresistible for the artist to represent it as a primate Adam and Eve, walking, looking, having just been expelled, a Masaccio with fur, as it were, being expelled and finding their way through the world. And that's because, and we could explore this in the little time we have left, that's because the story of Adam and Eve, for all of its inadequacies or its weirdnesses, which are more than interesting than its inadequacies, is very difficult to escape from, and in fact, good to think with. Good to think with, because the very things that are difficult about it put us in touch with moral problems that we're continually grappling with. Because the Darwinian story, so far at least, the Darwinian story is very new, and we haven't yet figured out what to do with it. The Darwinian story has great difficulty explaining things like human responsibility, the relationship between ignorance and moral action, how much we need to be warned, how do we warn people, and so forth. All the things that the Adam and Eve story was actually triggering for the last several thousand years, so that I'm not a pious believer, as you probably gather, but my deep belief is that the reason that this story is still around is not because people are ridiculously credulous and foolish, but because the story is so deep. Because actually, stories are what we grapple with if we're trying to make sense of the world in its most difficult moments. and that the relationship in that sense between the visions of religion and the visions of our greatest artists, our greatest writers and painters and sculptors, that those coincide in the moments at which we're trying to understand our lives. With that, I'll stop, and thank you for being patient with me.